A billionaire humiliates a black family at a luxury restaurant, but what happens next will leave everyone speechless. When the waiter hands him a mysterious note, his world begins to crumble. Stay tuned for a story of prejudice, redemption, and an unexpected twist that no one saw coming. The La Belle Époque restaurant was the crown jewel of Manhattan's elite dining scene. Every evening, the city's wealthiest and most influential figures gathered under its golden chandeliers, sipping vintage wines and indulging in meals crafted by world-renowned chefs. Tonight was no exception. The atmosphere was thick with the quiet murmur of high society, deals being made, fortunes being flaunted. Seated at the best table near the panoramic window was Archibald Cross, a man whose name alone carried weight in financial circles. A self-made billionaire, he had built his empire on ruthless business tactics and an unshakable belief in his own superiority. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his silver hair neatly combed back, he swirled the deep red wine in his glass, savoring its aroma with the satisfaction of a man who believed the world belonged to him. The restaurant doors swung open. A family stepped inside, a tall, elegant woman in a modest but sophisticated dress, a dignified man in a well-fitted blazer, and two children, a boy around 10 and his younger sister. Their presence immediately shifted the room's energy. Conversation slowed. Eyes flickered toward them, some filled with curiosity, others with something colder. The maitre d', Mr. Davenport, hesitated for a moment before approaching the newcomers. He knew exactly who they were. Elias and Naomi Gray were not strangers to success. She was a respected attorney, and he was one of the top cardiothoracic surgeons in the country. They were more than capable of affording a meal at La Belle Époque, but to some patrons, their presence was an unwelcome reminder that money did not belong to one's skin color. Davenport forced a polished smile. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" Naomi returned his gaze steadily. "Yes. Under Gray." The maitre d' hesitated just a fraction of a second too long. "Ah, well. I'm afraid we are completely booked this evening." Naomi's expression didn't change, but her sharp eyes flicked to the half-empty tables around the room. Elias exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around his son's shoulder. Before Naomi could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Are we really doing this?" A young waiter, Simon, stood nearby, holding a tray of glasses. His jaw was set, his grip firm. Davenport shot him a warning glance. Archibald Cross chuckled from his seat, loud enough for those nearby to hear. He turned his attention to Naomi and Elias, his voice dripping with mockery. "This restaurant has standards," he said, swirling his wine. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Elias's shoulders tensed. His son, Aidan, shrank closer to him, while little Leia clung to her mother's hand. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but cutting. "I wasn't aware that ignorance was part of the dress code." A soft gasp rippled through the nearby tables. Cross's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure. "Let's not make a scene," Davenport interjected hastily. Cross smirked. "Oh, I'm not. But let's be honest, this establishment was never meant for." A folded piece of paper slid across the table toward him. Cross blinked, frowning. He turned to see the waiter, Simon, standing over him, his face unreadable. "What's this?" Cross asked, lifting the paper. Simon met his gaze. "A note, sir." With a grunt, Cross unfolded it, his brow furrowing as he read the words scrawled in neat handwriting. "Beware the shadows of your own prejudice. They may consume you before you realize it." For the first time that evening, Archibald Cross had nothing to say. The drive home was silent. Elias gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Naomi sat beside him, staring out the window, her reflection barely visible against the city lights. In the back seat, Aidan and Leia were quiet. The weight of the evening pressed down on all of them. It wasn't the first time they had experienced racism. But tonight, something about it felt different, sharper, more venomous. Maybe it was because of how blatant it was. Maybe it was because their children had witnessed it so clearly, with no room for excuses or softening the truth. Naomi finally broke the silence. We should have left the moment that man opened his mouth. Elias exhaled slowly. And let him win. Is it winning if we refuse to let them humiliate us? Elias didn't answer right away. He glanced at the rearview mirror, at his son's solemn face. Aiden's hands were clenched into fists in his lap. Leah, nestled against her brother, was holding onto his sleeve like she was afraid to let go. They were staring at us, Aiden murmured suddenly. Like we didn't belong. Naomi turned around in her seat. Aiden. I don't get it, he continued, his voice quiet but firm. Dad, you save lives. Mom, you fight for justice. Why do people still look at us like we're less? Elias's grip on the wheel tightened. He had spent his entire life working harder, pushing himself further, believing that success would shield him from moments like this. But the truth was cruel. It didn't matter how many degrees he had, how many awards lined his office walls. To people like Archibald Cross, his worth was still measured by the color of his skin. Leah's voice was barely above a whisper. Are we really not supposed to be there? Naomi reached back, taking her daughter's small hand in hers. Of course we belong. We belong anywhere we choose to be. Elias nodded, but inside, something was burning. Aiden was looking for answers he wasn't sure how to give. By the time they reached home, the story had already started to spread. Someone had recorded the confrontation at La Belle Époque and posted it online. Naomi's phone was buzzing with messages. Friends, colleagues, even strangers were reaching out. Some offered support. Others dismissed it. Why make everything about race? Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. You people always play the victim. Elias tossed his phone onto the kitchen counter, his jaw tight. Naomi skimmed through the messages, her face unreadable. Then, one stood out. A well-known journalist had reached out. We'd love to hear your side of the story. Naomi turned to Elias. What do you think? He ran a hand down his face. I think, if we don't speak up, people like Cross will keep getting away with it. Naomi nodded. Then we tell the truth. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Billionaire humiliates black family at elite restaurant, waiters note sparks firestorm. The internet had exploded. Some people were outraged. Others defended Cross, twisting the narrative. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Archibald Cross sat in his penthouse, staring at the same words he had read the night before. Beware the shadows of your own prejudice. They may consume you before you realize it. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. Archibald Cross sat in the dim glow of his penthouse office, the skyline of Manhattan stretching beyond the glass walls. The city was alive beneath him, pulsing with movement, ambition, and the illusion that he had always believed in: power belonged to those who took it. But tonight, something was different. The silence in the room was heavy. His phone, usually a gateway to deals and congratulations, now buzzed with calls he didn't want to answer. Emails flooded in, but the subject lines all bled together. Crisis management needed immediately. Urgent, PR nightmare. Call me, we need a statement. The world was watching. And for the first time in decades, Archibald wasn't in control of the narrative. He scrolled through the news articles, his scowl deepening. Billionaire publicly humiliates black family at elite restaurant. When power meets prejudice, the Archibald Cross controversy. A single note that shook a tyrant. That damn note. He had dismissed it at first, but now the words were crawling under his skin. He reached into his pocket and pulled it out, unfolding it with slow, deliberate fingers. Beware the shadows of your own prejudice. They may consume you before you realize it. A ridiculous, self-righteous message from some naive waiter. And yet. Archibald clenched his jaw and tossed the note onto the desk. Then came the next blow. A knock at his office door. It was his assistant, Veronica, a woman who had worked for him for nearly 20 years. Normally composed, tonight she looked tense. "You should see this," she said, sliding a tablet onto the desk. Archibald pressed play on the video. It was a clip from a morning news show. The host sat across from a woman he recognized immediately, Naomi Gray. She was composed, as always, her voice even and controlled. "This isn't about a dinner reservation," she was saying. "This is about the quiet, insidious ways that power is used to exclude, belittle, and humiliate people who don't fit into the carefully curated world of men like Archibald Cross." Archibald's nostrils flared. The host nodded. "Many people are saying that this was just an unfortunate misunderstanding." Naomi's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I imagine that's easy to say when you've never had your children look up at you and ask why they aren't welcome somewhere." Archibald clenched his jaw. The camera cut to a different angle. Elias Gray was sitting beside her, his face set like stone. "I've spent my life saving people," Elias said, his voice calm but pointed. "I've performed over 1,000 surgeries, operated on people from every background imaginable. And yet, to a man like Cross, I'm still just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time." Archibald snapped the tablet shut. "Enough." But Veronica wasn't done. She hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Sir, your grandson spoke out." Archibald felt something twist in his stomach. "Ollie?" Veronica nodded, then turned the tablet back toward him. It was a social media post. His grandson, Oliver Cross, had written a statement. "I refuse to be silent. What happened at that restaurant was wrong. Prejudice, whether loud or whispered behind closed doors, is still prejudice. I won't pretend to stand by my grandfather's actions just because we share a last name. Change starts with accountability." Archibald's breath came slow and measured. His own blood. His own legacy. Turning against him. He shot up from his chair, his voice sharp. "Call the board. Call the PR team. We need to control this before it gets worse." Veronica hesitated. "What?" he snapped. "It already has." She turned the tablet back toward him one last time. Headlines were everywhere. Archibald Cross faces corporate fallout, investors pull out amid scandal. Luxury brands sever ties with Cross Enterprises. Family rift, Oliver Cross publicly condemns his grandfather. Archibald felt a cold weight settle in his chest. For the first time in his life, his power wasn't enough to shield him. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if it ever truly had been. The world outside Archibald Cross's penthouse was moving at its usual relentless pace, cars honked in the streets below, city lights flickered in the distance, and yet, inside, everything had come to a standstill. For the past 3 days, he had been flooded with calls, emails, and messages from people he once considered allies. Investors were pulling out. Business partners were distancing themselves. The media had latched onto the controversy like vultures, dissecting every detail of his actions at La Belle Époque. But none of it hurt as much as his grandson's words. "I refuse to be silent." Archibald exhaled sharply, tossing his phone onto the desk. He had built his empire on the belief that strength came from never bending, never apologizing. He had outlasted market crashes, political scandals, corporate betrayals, yet this was different. This was personal. A knock at the door. His assistant, Veronica, stepped in cautiously. "Sir, there's someone here to see you." "I told you, I'm not taking meetings." She hesitated. "It's Simon Carter." Archibald frowned. Who? The waiter from La Belle Époque, she clarified. The one who gave you the note. Silence hung between them. Archibald's instinct was to refuse. To send the boy away and bury himself in the damage control strategies his PR team was desperately assembling. But something, curiosity, maybe, made him nod. Send him in. A moment later, Simon stepped inside. He was younger than Archibald had realized, maybe mid-20s. His uniform was gone, he wore a plain button-up and jeans, carrying himself with quiet confidence. Archibald didn't bother with pleasantries. What do you want? Simon met his gaze without flinching. I came to see if you actually read the note. Archibald narrowed his eyes. You think I'd waste my time on sentimental nonsense? Simon's lips twitched slightly. Then why did you agree to see me? The old man leaned back in his chair, studying the young man in front of him. He didn't know whether to be annoyed or impressed by his nerve. Simon continued, I've worked at that restaurant for almost 5 years. I've seen a lot of powerful men walk through those doors. You all act the same, like the world belongs to you, like no one can challenge you. He shrugged. And usually, no one does. But that night, you were challenged. Archibald scoffed. By who? A family whining about bad service? Simon's expression hardened. By your own actions. The words hit harder than they should have. Archibald didn't respond, and Simon took a slow breath before continuing. I wrote that note because I've watched men like you walk over people my whole life. You don't see the destruction you leave behind. Or maybe you do, and you just don't care. He leaned forward slightly. But here's the thing, you're not untouchable anymore. The world is changing. People are watching. And now, you have a choice. Archibald folded his arms. And what choice is that? Simon met his gaze. Do you want to be remembered as the man who let his own arrogance destroy him? Or do you want to prove, if not to the world, then at least to yourself, that you can be better? Archibald laughed dryly. You think one speech is going to change a lifetime of who I am? No, Simon admitted. But I think you're already changing. Otherwise, you wouldn't have let me in this room. Archibald didn't respond. For the first time in years, he didn't have a quick retort, a sharp comeback, a way to make himself feel like the smartest man in the room. Simon stood up. I don't expect you to fix everything overnight. But I do think you should start with the people you hurt. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. And for what it's worth, you don't have to let your shadows consume you. But it's up to you. Then he was gone. Archibald sat in silence for a long time. For the first time in his life, he wondered if power wasn't about control, but about the willingness to face what you've been running from. The cold, sterile smell of the hospital hit Archibald crossed the moment he stepped through the automatic doors. He had always hated hospitals, the vulnerability of them, the way they stripped a man of his power and left him at the mercy of doctors, machines, and fate. But today, he wasn't here as a patient. Today, he was here to see the man whose life he had tried to diminish. The irony wasn't lost on him. A week had passed since the incident at La Belle Époque, and in that time, the media storm had only grown worse. His investments were failing. Business partners were cutting ties. Even some of his closest friends had distanced themselves, whispering about him as though he were already a ghost of the man he used to be. But none of that was why he was here. He stepped toward the front desk, ignoring the curious glances from nurses and visitors who recognized him from the headlines. I need to speak with Dr. Elias Gray, he said, his voice gruff. The receptionist blinked in surprise but quickly masked it with professionalism. Do you have an appointment? No. She hesitated, glancing at her computer. Dr. Gray is with a patient right now. I can let him know you're here. That won't be necessary, a voice interrupted. Archibald turned. Elias Gray stood at the end of the hallway, his expression unreadable. Dressed in a white coat, his posture calm and composed, he looked nothing like the man Archibald had seen in the restaurant that night. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Elias nodded toward an empty hallway. "Follow me." Archibald did. They walked in silence through the quiet corridors until they reached a small lounge reserved for doctors. It was empty. Elias shut the door behind them and turned. "Why are you here?" Archibald let out a slow breath. He had spent his entire life commanding rooms, making men bend to his will, but here, standing in front of Elias Gray, he felt something unfamiliar. Unease. "I came to talk." Elias folded his arms. "You don't strike me as the kind of man who talks unless he has something to gain." Archibald smirked, but there was no real amusement behind it. "Maybe I'm just getting old." Elias didn't smile. "Say what you came to say." Archibald hesitated. The words felt foreign in his mouth, but for the first time in years, he forced himself to speak them anyway. "I was wrong." Elias's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, whether it was surprise, skepticism, or something else, Archibald couldn't tell. "I treated you and your family with disrespect," Archibald continued. "I acted like you didn't belong. And I need you to know, it wasn't personal." Elias let out a short, humorless laugh. "It wasn't personal?" He shook his head. "That's the problem, Cross. It wasn't personal for you. But for my wife? My children? For every person who has to walk into places like that and prove they have a right to exist? It's always personal." Archibald looked away. He had expected resistance, but hearing it spoken so plainly made something twist in his chest. "I know an apology doesn't change anything," he said finally. "But I also know what it feels like to lose everything." Elias studied him. "Is that what this is about? You're losing power, so now you want redemption?" Archibald sighed. "Would it matter if I was?" Elias was silent for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "No. Because redemption isn't something you take, it's something you earn." Archibald looked down at his hands. They had once built an empire, crushed competitors, shaped industries. But now, they felt empty. "What would you do," he asked, "if you were me?" Elias didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "You have two choices. You can fade into obscurity, living out the rest of your life as the man who let his own prejudice ruin him. Or, you can start making things right. Not for the cameras. Not for your reputation. But because it's the right thing to do." Archibald exhaled slowly. "And where would I even start?" Elias held his gaze. "With my son." Archibald frowned. "Aiden?" Elias nodded. "You stole something from him that night, his belief that the world is fair. You made him question his worth. If you're serious about change, prove it to him." Archibald didn't know what to say. For the first time in his life, money, power, and influence meant nothing. And for the first time, he wondered if they ever really had. The soft hum of conversation filled the small bookstore, blending with the quiet rustle of pages turning. It was a cozy space, warm, inviting, the kind of place Archibald Cross had never stepped foot in before. But tonight, he was here for a reason. In the far corner, seated on a colorful rug in the children's section, Aiden Gray sat hunched over a book. His small fingers traced the words on the page, his dark curls falling slightly into his eyes. Across from him, his little sister Leia giggled softly, pointing at an illustration of a knight and a dragon. Archibald hesitated at the entrance, gripping his cane. His body ached from years of power and arrogance pressing down on him, but this? This was the first time in decades he had felt truly nervous. He hadn't told Elias or Naomi he was coming. He hadn't called ahead or sent someone in his place. He knew that if he wanted to do this, he had to do it himself. So he took a breath and walked forward. Aiden noticed him first. The boy's expression shifted instantly, from curiosity to confusion, then something colder. He sat up straighter, his small shoulders tensing. Leia, oblivious, kept flipping through the book. Archibald cleared his throat. "May I sit?" Aiden didn't answer right away. He stared at the old man in front of him, his young mind clearly working through the memory of their last encounter. Then, finally, he shrugged. "It's a free country." Archibald smirked slightly at the boy's sharp wit but quickly erased it. This wasn't a moment for amusement. He lowered himself carefully onto the wooden bench beside them, feeling more out of place than he ever had in a room full of billionaires. Aiden closed his book but didn't look away. "Why are you here?" Archibald exhaled. There was no easy way to say this. "Because I owe you something." The boy's brow furrowed. "Like what?" Archibald shifted, leaning slightly forward. "An apology." Aiden's eyes flickered with something, shock, maybe, or disbelief. His lips parted slightly, like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "I was wrong, Aiden," Archibald continued. "The way I spoke to you and your family. The way I treated you. It was disgraceful." He swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet the boy's gaze. "You didn't deserve that." For a long moment, Aiden didn't say anything. His small hands tightened around the book in his lap. "You don't even know me," he finally said, his voice quieter than before. "You just saw me and decided I didn't belong." Archibald's chest tightened. "I know. And I hate that I did." Aiden's jaw clenched, his eyes suddenly glossy with frustration. "I used to think people like you would like me if I just worked hard enough. If I was smart enough. But you didn't even care. You just..." He stopped, exhaling sharply, then shook his head. Archibald felt a pang of guilt deeper than anything the newspapers could have written about him. He had always prided himself on being an honest man, but the truth was, he had never truly examined himself before now. "I was blind," he admitted. "For a long time. I let the world teach me the wrong things, and I never questioned them. Until now." Aiden frowned, skeptical. "So why are you here?" Archibald hesitated. "Because I want to change. And because I don't want the last thing you remember about me to be a moment of hate." Aiden studied him, searching for something, maybe sincerity, maybe proof that this wasn't just another empty speech. Then, quietly, he said, "People like you don't change." Archibald flinched but nodded slowly. "Maybe not. But I'd like to try." Aiden said nothing, his young mind weighing the words of an old man who had once dismissed him without a second thought. Then Leia suddenly spoke. "Do you want to hear the story we're reading?" she asked, holding up the book. "It's about a knight." Archibald blinked. The invitation was so simple, so innocent, and yet it held more weight than any business deal he had ever made. He glanced at Aiden, who rolled his eyes but pushed the book toward him. "I guess you can read a little," the boy muttered. A small, unexpected warmth filled Archibald's chest. He reached for the book with slightly trembling fingers, feeling the weight of something he couldn't quite name. And for the first time in his life, he realized that redemption didn't come in grand gestures. Sometimes, it started with a story. Archibald Cross had spent decades sitting at the finest tables in the world, private clubs, elite boardrooms, Michelin-starred restaurants where waiters moved like shadows, ensuring his every comfort. But tonight, as he stepped into the modest home of the Gray family, he felt more out of place than he ever had before. The house was warm, not in temperature, but in feeling. Photos lined the walls, pictures of family vacations, school events, framed certificates of achievement. The scent of something home-cooked lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, curated perfection he had always known. Elias Gray stood by the dining table, his arms crossed, watching Archibald carefully. Naomi was setting down plates, her movements precise, controlled, as if she were still deciding whether he was truly welcome. At the far end of the room, Aidan sat with his little sister, flipping through a book. He glanced up, caught Archibald's eye, then quickly looked away. Archibald swallowed hard and turned to Elias. "Thank you for having me." Elias didn't reply right away. He studied the older man, as if measuring the weight of those words, then finally gave a short nod. "Let's eat." The meal was simple: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, greens, but to Archibald, it felt like a test. Every movement, every word, carried meaning here. He wasn't sure when the last time was that he had sat at a table like this, with no business to conduct, no deals to close. Just people, sharing a meal. Naomi finally broke the silence. "I'd like to know why you're really here, Mr. Cross." Archibald set down his fork. He had expected this. "I told you, I was wrong. And I don't want my legacy to be built on hate." Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. "You didn't care about your legacy when you humiliated my children in front of an entire restaurant." Archibald flinched. Elias leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're here now, but what happens when the cameras move on? When the media stops talking about you? Is this real, or is this damage control?" Archibald exhaled slowly. "I don't expect you to believe me right away. I wouldn't, if I were you. But I do know that I spent my life thinking I had all the answers, and that night, I realized how wrong I was." He looked at Aidan. I saw it in his eyes. Aidan shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak. Naomi studied him carefully. "So what exactly do you plan to do?" Archibald hesitated. He had asked himself this question over and over. Throwing money at a problem was easy, donating to charities, funding scholarships. But he knew now that real change required something more. "I want to listen," he said at last. "To learn. And to put my power to use in ways that matter." Elias folded his arms. "That's a start. But words aren't enough." "I know," Archibald admitted. For a moment, there was only the sound of silverware clinking against plates. Then Leah, small and bright-eyed, turned to him. "You're different than I thought," she said matter-of-factly. Archibald blinked. "Oh." She nodded. "You're not as mean as you looked that night." Aidan huffed. "He still has a long way to go." Archibald chuckled, a small, genuine laugh he hadn't heard from himself in years. "I do." Elias met his gaze. "Then let's see if you mean it." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a door left slightly open. And for the first time, Archibald was willing to step through. The grand chandeliers of La Belle Époque shimmered above the guests, casting golden light across the marble floors. It was a scene Archibald Cross had known well, elegant, exclusive, untouchable. But tonight, everything felt different. Tonight, he wasn't the man who once sat at the best table, looking down on the world. He was here to prove that he had changed. As he stepped through the doors, heads turned. Whispers followed him. The same high society elites who once hung on his every word now watched him with suspicion, curiosity, even contempt. But Archibald ignored them. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on the family sitting at the very table he once considered his own. The Grays. Naomi, poised and confident, her expression unreadable. Elias, ever composed, watching him carefully. Aidan sat with his back straight, his face a mixture of uncertainty and defiance, while little Leah kicked her feet under the table, humming softly to herself. They had accepted his invitation. That was the first step. Archibald took a breath, steadying himself, then walked toward them. The maitre d', the same one who had tried to turn the Greys away that night, looked uncertain as he approached. But Archibald simply nodded. "I'll be joining them." He pulled out a chair and sat down. Aidan was the first to speak. "So what's the plan? You make a speech about how much you've changed and expect everything to be fine." Archibald met the boy's gaze. "No. I expect nothing. I just want to share a meal." Aidan narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Archibald sighed. "Because I want to learn what I never cared to understand before." He looked around the table. "Because I don't want our last conversation to be the only thing you remember about me." Naomi exchanged a glance with Elias before she spoke. "And what happens after tonight?" Archibald leaned forward slightly. "That depends on what you think should happen." Elias studied him. "Are you willing to listen?" For the first time in my life, Archibald admitted, yes. The tension at the table didn't disappear, but something shifted. A waiter appeared, hesitant. "Shall I take your orders?" Naomi nodded, handing him the menu. As the orders were placed and conversation hesitantly began, Archibald felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not power. Not control. Something smaller, but far more valuable. A chance. Aidan finally spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You know. I read a new book about knights." Archibald raised an eyebrow. "Oh." The boy nodded. "The best knights weren't the strongest ones. They were the ones who admitted when they were wrong." Archibald swallowed. "Sounds like a good story." Aidan shrugged. "It's not over yet." Archibald nodded slowly. Neither was his. At its core, this story isn't just about redemption, it's about the uncomfortable, necessary journey of confronting one's own prejudice. Archibald Cross was a man who spent his entire life believing power was his shield, that his wealth and influence placed him above consequence. But in a single night, he learned that the greatest threat to his legacy wasn't an external force, it was himself. Change is never immediate and it's rarely easy. True transformation doesn't come from a single apology or a grand gesture. It comes from consistency, from the willingness to sit in discomfort, to listen without defensiveness, and to act with intention long after the cameras have stopped rolling. Archibald's story is a reminder that no one is beyond redemption, but also that redemption is never owed, it must be earned. The Grey family didn't grant him immediate forgiveness, nor did they forget what he had done. Instead, they allowed him the opportunity to prove that his change was real, that he was willing to do more than just regret his actions, he was willing to correct them. And perhaps the most important lesson comes from Aidan's final words. The best knights weren't the strongest, they were the ones who admitted when they were wrong. Because acknowledging our flaws isn't a sign of weakness. It's the first step toward becoming something better.